Here at Moorlands, we've been training Christians passionate about Jesus Christ since 1948, training them in the skills and the knowledge that they need to impact the church and the world. In this film, we're going to explore the remarkable story of this college, its history and where it's come from, and celebrate the impact that we continue to make on the world around us. I invite you to come with me on a journey where we listen to the stories of principals and staff, graduates and friends, and learn about how we move from humble beginnings in this story to students studying at multiple locations and continuing to do so as we look to the future. Our story began back in 1948 with one man's vision. David Clifford had been in America for 6 months, been preaching at evangelistic events, but had also seen training that was being given for men and women in evangelism. It was through these experiences that David felt stirred to start a similar work back in Britain. Upon his return, he shared his vision with a friend, describing that he felt called to start a Bible college on the south coast. His friend suggested starting it in nearby Matlock, and after finding a property, David set out on a bold adventure of faith to purchase the property with no funds to support such a purchase. Remarkably, the specific conditions that he'd set before the vendors were agreed, and by means of a wonderful answer to prayer, God also provided a principal, Mr. John Welch, a retired headmaster. David Clifford became vice principal and learned the necessary skills to assume the principalship after 3 years. The initial cohort of students had a more regimented programme than our students experience nowadays. Learning to live and study alongside each other was a helpful aid in preparing students for a life of ministry. One of the benefits of being part of the Moorlands family was, and continues to be, the relational development that occurs in doing life alongside others. This is evident nowadays as we see this worked out as an interdenominational college. Our students learn to understand other people's perspectives and have their own thinking challenged. Those early days of living together started at 6:30 in the morning, when students were woken to observe their personal devotional time before the morning prayers at 7:30 a.m. Breakfast followed at 8 o'clock with lectures all morning from 9 until 12:30. The ringing of the bell was a key feature of Moorlands life that lasted for many years and helped reinforce this routine. After lunch, students engaged in practical work from 2 until 4, before tea at 4:30 p.m. Private study came next until evening prayers at 9 in the evening. Students had to be in by 10 o'clock and it was lights out at 10:30. I'm really not sure how our students would respond to that nowadays. On occasion, in those formative years, students would even attend lectures outside. It's something that some of us as lecturers would still opt to do at any given opportunity. But since those early days, we've extended the variety of lectures, the styles of teaching, and have got plenty more tools at our ready, especially since the introduction of virtual teaching, and that allows us to be much more versatile in our approach to education. The original aim was to provide practical training and opportunities alongside theological studies. But there was also a strong emphasis on medical training. In those days, as many students headed into the mission field, there was a significant need for those who had medical training. A missionary might have to travel for several days to get medical support if it was required. Applied theology is still at the heart of what we do. It's in our strapline, Christian Theology Applied. We believe not only in forming people's mind and thinking about God and the Bible, but also applying it into the real world situations. Over the years, our students have had many opportunities to share the gospel and to try out different approaches to evangelism, often learning from those who've got plenty to share on the subject. It must have been such an inspiring start to our college's early years when Billy Graham was hosted at Matlock. And Moorlands College has always emphasised those opportunities to put into practice the things that we learn. Back in the 1950s, that looked like the Moorlands Treks, where students would set out with 10 shillings and a leader on a venture of faith. I just want to read to you one example from back in 1952 of a student trek that appeared in the 1953 copy of the Matlock Message. On June the 7th, 9 of us set out on our 7 weeks evangelistic trek, which took us nearly 500 miles and into 10 counties. We experienced the provision of the Lord, and we went trusting Him alone, for we took only weekend rations. A number of times we got to the end of our resources, and then God provided for us. That it was the Lord who provided was clear, for never once did we miss a meal, though we still remember when semolina made with water was the main meal of the day. Like the Apostle Paul, we had to learn how to abound and how to be abased. And then there was the lady who, not knowing how many of us there were, was led to give us a few eggs, in fact 9, and she didn't know that we had had no breakfast for the following day. The Lord abundantly blessed us in the evangelistic work, and we had the joy of seeing many accept the Lord Jesus as their Saviour. Now that spirit of placement is still evident in what we do as a college today. Spending a number of weeks on block placement, both in the UK and also overseas, students have ministered in the Middle East, in Australia, in New Zealand, across Europe. They've had opportunity to put into practice the things that they learn. And that same passion that's guided Moorlands College to apply theology to life remains the heartbeat of what we do right up to this day. Another extraordinary link that we've had is with the 20th century theologian F.F. Bruce. And recently as a college we've begun work on a project to try to edit and reproduce some of the great works of F.F. Bruce to make them accessible and up-to-date for students to use today. And so it's great as we look back to discover these intriguing little links. For example, in a copy of the Matlock Message from November 1953, there's an article by F.F. Bruce. It's under the title, "More Manuscript Discoveries from Near the Dead Sea." Now, of course, 1953, this was just after the discovery near Qumran of tiny fragments that would be assembled together to give us a very early copy of what the Old Testament would have looked like from even before the time of Jesus. F.F. Bruce would write, "When 5 or 6 years ago the first announcement was made of the discovery of a group of manuscripts in the Dead Sea region of Palestine, including some portions of the Hebrew Old Testament, 1,000 years earlier than the oldest hitherto known, it is not surprising that the news was greeted with scepticism. And yet, as F.F. Bruce would point out, even in a few years of their discovery, these would go on to be confirmed to be authentic, reliable, useful, very early copies of many of the books of the Old Testament." He closed his little article with these words, "The condition of these fragments is such that their treatment and study will take a long time, but we look forward to most interesting and encouraging additions to our biblical knowledge when the results of all this study are published." And here we are decades later, and we now know a great deal about the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, we regularly take students out to Israel, to the Holy Land, and many of them are able to see some of those Dead Sea Scrolls housed in the Israel Museum as part of the Shrine of the Book. And so that continued commitment to engaging with archaeology and with scholarship, something that F.F. Bruce was a significant pioneer of in terms of evangelical theology, is something we still hold as very important to our work here at Moorlands. In fact, our link with F.F. Bruce was seen again a little later in 1958, when the college created the possibility for students to become associate members of Moorlands Bible College. And to do so, they had to write a 25,000-word thesis. And F.F. Bruce was one of the adjudicators involved in assessing that student work. In March 1955, the college moved to Devon, into a property with unrivalled views of the South Devon coast. Halfway between Dawlish and Teignmouth, the buildings boasted 10 acres of lovely grounds with plenty of room to expand. A chapel was added and opened by the college president on the 18th of October 1962. Since relocating to Devon, the college changed from being co-educational and became for men only, and remained that way until the Ladies' College opened on the 3rd of October 1964. I'm reading from the Moorlands Ladies' College prospectus from the 1960s, And we've got here an idea of what the fees were like back in those days. For the Diploma in Bible course, it was £170 per annum. For the Diploma in Theology, £180 per annum. For a Diploma in Missionary course for students taking missionary practical studies, £140 per annum. And the registration for AMBC examination came to 3 guineas. And it notes in here that fees do not include textbooks or laundry. The qualifications for admission includes this paragraph. The normal educational standard for entrance is the GCE ordinary level. Those without this qualification may be accepted if they can at their interview show their ability to attain this level quickly and go on to gain the Moorlands diploma. And all of this would be reflected in our continued commitment to recognising prior learning as part of the entrance into the Moorlands programme.
It was 1967 that I first went to Moorlands in the October. And as I say, I was 19 at the time and a relatively young Christian. I'd gone to college just really off the back of that period with Billy Graham coming to the UK 2 years consecutively. And I was involved in a small way in what that was going on in London. And now to be actually with guys that looking for every opportunity to share their faith. It seemed that for many of them, wherever they went, they wanted to talk about Jesus. And that challenged me, but it also encouraged me. And when you're in that kind of atmosphere, you're stimulated to grasp a hold of this and think now, how much do I care in order to bring people to Christ? And, as I look back now, my time at Moorlands was so far too short, but it did have a significant impact.
Anyone with a keen eye would know that we're called Moorlands College. Often people refer to us as Moorlands Bible College. Now, our original name, of course, was Matlock Bible College, because that's where David Clifford, the founder of our college, began this work. When the college relocated into Devon, there was, of course, a need for a name change. But what name to call it? Dawlish Bible College? Teignmouth Bible College? The story behind our name change at that stage really comes from a need requiring careful use of our resources. See, we had stationery that had been printed with a motto, Truth with Vision, and the initials of the college, MBC, Matlock Bible College. In order to avoid all the unnecessary expense of producing yet more stationery, it was decided to change our name to something else that would fit those initials, MBC. So given the locality near to Dartmoor and Exmoor, our name became Moorlands Bible College. It was both an appropriate name for the region and also good stewardship of resources. And so we went from Matlock Bible College to Moorlands Bible College. And in 1964, we added Moorlands Ladies College. The name then changed to Moorlands College Christian Training Centre, and then became what we are now, Moorlands College Christian Theology Applied. Now, as the college seeks degree awarding power, that's going to raise the possibility of yet another debate over a name change as we think about university status. But the issue of dropping the word Bible from our name has raised some questions, and many of us staff have met with people who've asked us, what is it with Moorlands? Why did we drop the Bible? Well, of course, we never dropped the Bible from Moorlands College, but the word has disappeared from our name. And the reason for that is explained by our third principal, Derek Copley.
The original name that was given to us, obviously, was Moorlands Bible College. It got changed by some of the students into Moorlands Bridal College, but that's another story. It was my Board of Governors, the trustees, who felt that we should drop the word Bible because we were beginning to take people from other countries where it wouldn't have been okay to have the word Bible in their applications for funding and visas and so on. There were sensitivities there, so in the end, they decided to remove the word Bible and just call it Moorlands College. Needless to say, I fought this change because it felt like we'd dropped something very, very important. And many of the students, when they come back again, say, no, we wished you hadn't done that. We wish it was still Moorlands Bible College. And I said, well, it is still Moorlands Bible College, but the name had to change because of the different places from which people came.
As we progressed through the swinging 60s, Moorlands was thriving until in 1968 the college would experience its biggest challenge to date. The world was changing, and there was a level of unrest rising, with strikes and demonstrations becoming a normal feature in Britain. Moorlands wasn't immune to the changing dynamics of the 60s, and also faced its own time of difficulties. And so after 2 decades of faithful ministry, the painful decision was made to close both the men's and women's colleges in Devon. And so in 1968, the college had reached this very difficult situation without even a home. Not one to be defeated, David Clifford set about finding a new home for Moorlands College. And that led to Verwood, where a vicarage would become the temporary home for this new chapter in the story of Moorlands. I'm here at St Michael's Church in Verwood. Now the old vicarage, of course, is no longer here, but for a time when Moorlands moved here, this would become a very significant place for a time of transition from what had been a thriving college in Devon to a much more challenging time of rebirth here in Verwood. There were 7 new students, not one student from Devon had transferred here, and David Clifford and his family, of course, along with a retired local minister, the Reverend Hughes, who'd be senior lecturer for this new phase in the college's life. So I caught up with Ian Clifford to find out a little bit more about that difficult time in the college's life.
Coming up to 67, 68, there were difficulties, I think, in personal relationships right at the top. And I remember Dad being very traumatized by the fact that all that he and Mother had put together for 20 years seemed to be falling apart. Interestingly enough, he had some brilliant input in those difficult times. We're in the beginning of 68. From some great men of God. There was a man who was the principal of Birmingham Bible Institute at the time, who was a great help to Dad. I'll tell you why, because he had been through similar things, as the head of another Bible school, not Birmingham, but somewhere else. There was people, advisors that came in, but somehow or other, they were not able to find reconciliation. There was an attempt to even name 3 of the existing students as future leaders of a new college, and even that idea just disappeared. It was really a very heavy attack, in every sense of the word. So I remember Dad came to us in Barnstable, probably in the springtime of 68. He was very broken, and yet he wanted to move on. He wanted to maintain the vision. Obviously, he wasn't going to continue himself. He'd had enough, and Mother especially. But at that particular time, we decided to pray. And I remember going and praying in a field in Barnstable somewhere and asking God, what did he want us to do? I'd been married for a year with Elizabeth, and God very clearly said to me, you need to get on board. You need to go and get involved, not just for our parents' sake, but for the sake of the college, to which I owed so much in terms of my own personal pilgrimage, for the sake of, all that God wanted to do in the future. So we got involved.
It's been a real privilege to catch up with the more extended family of David Clifford and be reminded that the whole family had been gripped by this vision that God had given him. So not only catching up with Ian, but also with David's daughter Anita, we've been able to find out a little bit more about the family side to the story of Moorlands College.
I praise the Lord that never at any time has the vision and the work of Moorlands been stopped or suspended. It moves seamlessly from Matlock to Dawlish to Verwood to Sopley. And Verwood was a lovely venue. It was a lovely, I loved it there. Beautiful. It was purchased through the selling of the Dawlish campus, of course. Many people continued with my dad through that transition period, such as myself as secretary, my brother Ian as a lecturer, his wife Liz doing the cooking, Mr. Hughes and Mrs. Hughes. Mr. Hughes was a lecturer, but of course the two of them together were like grandma and grandpa, you know, in the college. So it was also like a family time together with those people who were there. And all those people, apart from me, you know, transferred to Sopley. You know, there was Roger Bacon, and then there was Ken Orman from Wimborne, and there was people like that. So every one of them transferred to Sopley except me. And during that time between Dawlish and Verwood, actually, Brash Bonsall, who was the principal of Birmingham Bible Institute, was a huge encouragement to my dad. And his prophetic word to him that the college would start with 7 students actually was the case. And other friends and lecturers gave encouragement at that time to my dad, a lot did. And it grew from there. And it just everyone just pressed on, you know, he was encouraged to just keep going on, keep going on. And that's what he did in the last couple of years at Dawlish, and then these years at Verwood. We just kept going on, eyes on Jesus, you know, focused on him, focused on the future. Yeah. So, and at the end of the first year, I think it was in Verwood, there was a reunion with about 20 old students came along. They might not have been old, but old, you know what I mean, who came and they praised God for the past and for the continuation of MBC. And they stood with my dad and staff in prayer and encouragement at that time, you know, just pressing on was the key. Yeah. And then after 2 years, my dad sold that Verwood property, of course, and then purchased the Sopley property and then sold it to the Greater European Mission for £1. So he handed the college over to the Greater European Mission, and the baton was passed on, of course, to Derek Copley, who then nurtured it and grew it from then onwards, with past students and past lecturers continuing to serve in teaching and administrative roles, you know. But, you know, Verwood was a very great place of restoration and healing and faith, like I said. And as my dad and the staff just marched forward, just marching forward with a vision for the future, you know, it was good. And the fulfillment of the vision of MBC, which began in 1948, you know, was led beautifully through that time by the Lord with peace and joy and expectation for the future. So Moorlands began and continued and came through and pressed on and kept on going as a lasting expression of its emphasis on mission and excellence, and its motto, truth with vision. And hundreds of students from, you know, 1948 until now, thank God for the years spent at Moorlands, as I do. And we, the Clifford family, say praise the Lord for all the lives that are transformed and have been transformed. And we are thrilled and privileged, us as Ian Gordon and myself, and of course the wider Clifford family. We are very privileged to be a small part of the Moorlands story, you know. And so we say with many others regarding Moorlands, to God be the glory, great things he has done.
The 2 years at Verwood proved to be an amazing time of rebirth for the college. And the relocating to Sopley was essential in 1970 for the new stage of growth and development, with 20 students starting. And that, of course, was the fruit of 2 years of hard graft and prayer. I'm here at the site of the old manor house at Sopley. Some of the remains are still visible. And though it was an attractive building, it was in a state of considerable disrepair when the college moved here. So for staff and for students, it would involve a great deal in terms of upkeep. Well, in terms of new beginnings, this was a great opportunity for Moorlands to seek to redevelop this site here at Christchurch. And so, though we no longer have the old manor building, we are still located in some of the most beautiful grounds in the area. Ian Clifford, David's son, remained a valuable part of Moorlands College and helped in the transition to Sopley. And we were then joined by a young man, Derek Copley, who became the principal and would help develop Moorlands College right through the 70s and 80s and 90s here at Sopley. And we're going to hear now from Derek a very moving account of his involvement as Moorlands College would develop and grow.
I had preached just once at a church in Cheshire, and in the audience was a man who had established Bible colleges all over Europe. And for some reason or other, he felt my sermon was appropriate to someone he thought might want to be the leader of a Bible college. So this man visited me in my home, and he said, "We'd like you to take on the responsibility for being principal of a Bible college," that's Moorlands. "Would you like to say yes?" I discussed it with my wife in his presence, and we said, no, we're definitely not doing that. I had just planted a church in Heaton Moor in Stockport near Manchester, and the church was thriving. I'd become its first pastor. I couldn't just leave a church like that and go off and rejuvenate a Bible college. So we sent him away, and a few weeks later, he was back on my doorstep again. "I'm still convinced you should head up Moorlands Bible College." So in the end, my wife and I agreed we would come down south and we would help to rejuvenate Moorlands. But I went to the bank and I said, "I'd like to borrow some money to start a Bible college." So I borrowed £30,000 without any collateral and bought this particular estate, which was 15 acres and a crumbling old manor house. It was very, very tough because the manor house was in awful state of repair. The roof leaked everywhere, the floorboards were rotten. One student even fell through into the basement at one point, and the plumbing didn't work, and nor did the electrics. So started out like that, and I had 2 or 3 local volunteers who helped me to get going, because they didn't want a salary, they just wanted to help me get going.
Other than the setbacks and that difficult time at the end of the 1960s, the story of the college has really been one of expansion and growth. It was at the beginning of the 1970s that Derek Copley shared his dreams with the board for an ambitious building project that would seek to build purpose-built residential accommodation along with the lecture rooms.
We began to grow numerically in student numbers, so we started out with just a handful. And by the mid-70s, we reached about 30 or 40. At the same time, when I'd been there about a year, I dreamt of a campus to replace the old manor house that was falling down. And so I had an architect draw up quite an ambitious campus which would hold about 200 students. I was still only about 31 or 32 at the time. And gradually, funds came in to build our first hall of residence, which is the Cedars.
The first stage of the project was to initiate the now infamous Cedars, a 2-storey block comprising of 16 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. In keeping with the faith demonstrated by David Clifford before him, Derek Copley signed the contracts in faith that God would provide. In the true Moorlands style that had been adopted in its formative years, the students and staff undertook much of the internal work and learned new skills along the way.
The number of people I gathered around me was very small. There were only 3 tutors, one of whom was the General Secretary. Another was a pastor who had helped the college over a period of time. And then there was me, who got no real theological background at all. We managed somehow, one of the men became the General Secretary, Ian Clifford, who was the son of the original founder back in the 1940s. And we managed with 1 or 2 extra staff who came to me free of charge. They were supported people from America. So I only had 2 salaries to pay at that time. The salaries were not exactly large by today's standards, and we did run it on a shoestring. So all the maintenance work on the buildings and all the work on the grounds was just done by the staff and the students pulling together.
As the college reached its silver jubilee, the Cedars building was occupied and other funds were put in place to proceed with further development of the campus. As the project continued into the 1980s, in what was to be another remarkable tale of God's provision, the staff and students again turned to regular prayer, asking for God's provision to bring in the remaining funds needed to pay for the latest bill. In a faith-building exercise, the remaining £40,000 needed came in at the very last minute, through 3 cheques arriving at the same time. It's a wonderful sign of God's goodness and another opportunity for staff and students alike to grow their faith muscles.
We never ever appealed to the public for any money. We simply prayed about it. It sounds a bit like Muller and others that, didn't seem possible in the 20th century and 21st century, but that's how we actually did it. And gradually the student numbers increased. We began to take more students who had qualifications, because we were originally taking virtually anybody who could read and write and had enough money for the £250 a year fees which we were charging then. So gradually our reputation increased, and I started up a thing called the Association of Bible College Principals. Here was I, aged about 31, with all these rather famous people in the other colleges, and somehow they said, okay, well, why don't you get this thing going? And it's one of those things which God called me to do in the very early days at Moorlands. We realised that the original ethos of the college was one that we wanted to maintain, which was an equal standing of academic, spiritual and practical. And therefore we decided to, as far as possible, make the academic programme of good quality, but trying to find a way of incorporating practical Christian service with personal development as being as important as the academic, and having the same academic excellence in it, which gradually was moving us towards a validation process. So we began to work on a portfolio method of evaluating practical Christian service. We also developed ways of measuring your own spiritual growth, and this became quite a tough course, because it had to have the academic rigour of a degree course which we were aiming towards, but it also had to be deeply spiritual at the same time, and that proved to be a challenge which we didn't know quite how to put it into place. But then Cheltenham and Gloucester College of Higher Education, as it was, they helped us to move forward. I think my relationships with the students was probably closer than one might expect from a college principal, and those relationships exist today. The group itself was full of fun, to the extent that some groups were quite upset with us because we had such a good time together and we enjoyed being together. But I think seeing students coming from a non-academic background, seeing them come out of things like prison and prostitution, to see them being trained, sent out into different parts of the world and this country, that to me has always been a thrill of seeing people who would not make it in real life, but here in this Bible college, they were transformed just by the atmosphere, the teaching, the form of training that we had to raise them up to that kind of spiritual and academic level. That will always stay with me. And I'm in touch with so many of these people who write me emails and send me all sorts of things. I wrote a book called My Chains Fell Off, which is from the hymn. I came, just after the book was published, I came into my study, or tried to, and what the students had done was to empty all my furniture out and then fill my study with bicycles. It was a smaller room than this. It was absolutely filled to the roof with bicycles. Similarly, a tutor, Roger Bacon, who was a former farmer, at another time they filled his study with bales of hay, so he couldn't get in either. So it was the bicycles right up to the ceiling that were the students' way of saying, "We love you, Derek."
Moorlands is often described as a family, and as the years have gone by, we've got a number of examples of students who've actually come from the same family over the generations. And that's really part of what was modelled by the Cliffords when they established this college.
The whole of our family moved down, obviously, and we lived on site. At the moment, we are in 2020, it's the coffee house, it's the staff house, but it was the Bennett house. Before that, it was Tim Marks's house. Tim and Olga lived there. So the Bennett house became the place for 10 years to hang out for students and do babysitting, and a place to escape to, along with Andrew and Lynn Penson, our next door neighbours, who similarly was a place to escape to.
Colin was part of the team for almost 3 decades, and he has the unique claim of having served under 3 different principals. During that time, he saw students become colleagues. And we're going to now hear from Andy Defer and Helen Hender, who are both students at Moorlands College who went on to become members of staff.
I walked through those front doors 1995.
Not those front doors, they weren't here.
Not those ones, the ones around the corner there that are still there. 1995, so long time ago. So a lot has changed. A lot has changed on the campus. A lot has changed for our lives. So it's a bit fun just to reminisce and look back. So thinking about memories from when we were here, what are the things that stick out in your mind from your years at Moorlands?
I mean, the accommodation's changed a lot. Should we start with that?
Just a bit.
I mean, for me, cold showers were the norm. The only power shower being in the sports hall, so you had to take a trek if you wanted a nice hot one in the morning. Yeah. Anything stand out for you?
Placements is one of the things that really stick out in my mind from my time here at Moorlands, and not just the local placements, but we had an opportunity to do a youth mission to Plymouth. We had that in those days. It was a youth track that went down to Plymouth. So we went down to Plymouth with vis-a-vis, and we went into schools and we invited young people to come to big events in the evening, and we saw a number of young people come to Faith. And I remember there was a band that were like really cool hip band, and we were kind of like the Moorlands dudes, the Moorlands students. So they had all this promo material of them on rocks looking really cool. So we decided that on our afternoon off we'd go down to the seaside in Plymouth, and we'd have all these photos taken of the youth track at Moorlands, and there's all these pictures of us on the rocks. I think we might have a couple of pictures there to show you. So that stuck out in my mind. And then also wider. So I went to Chicago for my block placement, my third year block placement, and spent some time with Young Life in Chicago. So for a Dorset country bumpkin to go to the inner city Chicago, it really was a challenge, and it really sort of shaped me. It's one of the things that I feel really passionate about for our students, that they don't ever choose the safe option for their block placements, but they push themselves out of their comfort zone, because that's the opportunity that God can really shape and form them. So Andy, you graduated in 2003, was it?
That's right.
Yeah, 2003, and then you went to Chinner, is that right?
Yep. Well, actually, I spent a year working with the youth service here in Dorset, while I was still the part-time youth pastor at the Elim Church in the middle of Bournemouth. And then, I took up a pastorate. It was a joint pastorate, overseeing the youth work in a church in Oxfordshire for 7 years. And we really saw some amazing things amongst the young people in particular. Saw some of the young people actually get trained at Moorlands years later, which was such a joy. I know, could you believe that? And then one day I got a phone call from Colin Bennett saying there was a job. Had I looked into it, and I felt compelled. Then I wasn't looking for a job, but I explored it, and well, here I am 10 years later. So Helen, you've been placement manager for 10 years. Tell me about some of the highlights, maybe working with the students, seeing those transformative moments.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm absolutely passionate about helping students to put into practice what they're learning in the classroom. So it's not just about getting the knowledge, but it's about how does that knowledge affect and transform your life and the life of those that you're ministering to. And I remember one student particularly sticks out in my mind, and it was block placement for the campus-based students here, and everyone had gone, and I had a knock on my door, and it was a student who was feeling particularly apprehensive about going so far away for her block placement. She lived locally and she was going all the way up to Birmingham for her placement, and she was really quite apprehensive and nervous about it. So I said, come on, let's go over and have some lunch together. So we went over to the dining room and we had some lunch and we talked and we prayed, and I just kind of like felt God was saying that this is a time that he wanted her to really step out in faith. So we talked about the parting of the Red Sea, and we kind of had this kind of terminology of you're going to walk on dry land as you go up to Birmingham. You're going to walk on dry land, and God's going to take you, and it's going to be an adventure. It's going to be great. And off she went up to Birmingham for her block placement. And you know what? She never came back. She ended up doing her placement-based third year up in Birmingham, and then she ended up working for the church up there in Birmingham. What a blessing to Birmingham that was. And that's a testimony of a student who was willing to take that step and to take that step of faith. And as she did, God met her and we saw incredible things. So it's my job, I get to see stories like that and see transformation in students like that. So yeah, incredible.
We have a very varied catalogue of stories of those who've been connected to college over a long period of time, not least David Clifford and Derek Copley. Our third principal, Derek, led the team until the late 1990s, inspiring those who he served with. In his time as principal, Derek continued to uphold the original vision of David Clifford. But he also transformed the college in many different ways and introduced new initiatives that would have a much wider impact on the evangelical world. Moorlands College spent the late 1990s introducing significant changes that would really strengthen the college for the challenges of the new millennium. Firstly, it became evident that a youth work programme for a faith-based community could successfully benefit from the requirements of the JNC and NYA endorsement. Secondly, the college's traditional faith constituency was increasingly involved in local community outreach and projects, often in partnership with statutory bodies. Thirdly, churches and other Christian organisations were increasingly aware of the value of employing youth workers and community workers who'd been professionally trained and developed the skills that were required for the JNC qualification. The college therefore decided to seek NYA endorsement for its training in youth work. And in 1999, the BA Honours in Applied Theology, Youth and Community Work was validated by the university and endorsed by the NYA. As well as these significant developments, as the new millennium approached, the baton of leadership was handed on once again, and Moorlands College welcomed Steve Brady as a new dynamic principal. An active sportsman and faithful supporter of Everton Football Club, Steve was already well known to the students as a lecturer and also as a keynote speaker at national events like Spring Harvest. We caught up with Steve to hear about his 2 decades of service as principal here at Moorlands.
Well, I've had the privilege of being involved with Moorlands College for the best part of 30 years. When we moved 30 years ago down to Bournemouth, where I was a pastor in the town, shortly afterwards I used to come over and part-time lecture here in the book of Revelation. So for my labours as a lecturer, part-time, I then joined the board, and for a while I was vice chair of the board, and then in the beginning of January 1998, I became a lecturer here in systematics and Christian doctrine. And then a year later or so, 15 months later, through a whole pile of remarkable incidents, and very appropriately for anybody who knows me, on the 1st of April 1999, I became principal. So I then had the privilege of being in that role for nearly 20 years. When I joined the staff of Moorlands in 1998 to celebrate 50 years of the college's existence, it had been decided when I was a board member a year or two before that we would try and raise funds to build a new chapel. Thankfully, in retrospect, that never came about. And I say thankfully because we'd have been stuck with a chapel we'd used just occasionally when lots of other things were screaming to be done. But just as I came into post a year later as principal, out of the blue, this had never happened before in any sizable amount and has certainly not happened since, a gentleman who had very little contact with the college left us about £300,000. And that started a whole process of thinking, well, what can we do to improve the stock here? So thankfully, we were able to cannibalize one of the 2 staff houses and use the 300,000 to create a conference room, a new reception, and a whole suite of offices. And that started the ball rolling. And then we decided, well, there's other things that need doing here, because it's like in a home or whatever, you know, you paint one wall and then the other wall needs it, and all the walls need it, and then you step out into another room and that needs doing, and everything was screaming. So before long we were involved in thinking, well, if we're going to be serious about being an academic institution, we need an extended library, especially if we're going to offer master's degrees. And so the library started with about £600,000. And it was remarkable to see how the Lord provided funds. The then bursar wrote to a little trust to say thank you for the small gift for a student. It may interest you to know we're building a library, thinking this small trust couldn't help us, but just to keep them in the loop that we were doing something. And they wrote back and said, oh, we love what you're doing. Would £100,000 help you with the building? Yes, thank you. Another trust we went to and thought we'd be cheeky and asked, could you help us with 100,000? They said, no, we think you need more, and gave us 200,000. So money came in big amounts like that. And then there was the 5,000 Club. All sorts of folk around the country were giving gifts, large and small. I bumped into a couple who said, Steve, we want to sign up for your 20 £5 a month gifting. They said, well, we actually can't afford that. We're going to do £10 a month. And to make that happen, they said every week we go and have a tea and a coffee and a cake between us at Marks and Spencer's. It costs us about £5. So every month we're paying £20 in teas and coffees. So we're going to only go twice a month and send you the other 10, which was lovely. And that started the main buildings off, and then we renovated what used to be the old nursery, and that came into student use. But then the feeling was always we need to do something significant for the aging buildings, especially what was the dining room with a flat roof which regularly leaked. And through a whole pile of remarkable circumstances, we've ended up with a beautiful hub and a beautiful auditorium come chapel, which was best part of £3 million. And again, it was the same story. Some folk coming with gifts large and others with gifts small.
As well as the further expansion of the facilities at Sopley, affectionately known as the Christchurch campus, Steve also introduced another way of studying, the placement-based programme, and that would include the extension of our studies through regional centres. And we're going to hear more about those regional centres now from Ian Coffey.
The development of centres at Moorlands is really quite a fascinating story. It began with SWIM, as we know it, Southwest Youth Ministries, which Ruth and I knew well, because we pastored a church in the Southwest in Plymouth, and we'd had people attached to SWIM who'd been on internships with us, and we knew they were quality people. And Colin Bennett had got this real vision that he felt was from God, that when Moorlands was sort of looking into the future, we couldn't simply say to people, well, up sticks and come to Christchurch and train. It was just impractical. But where we could partner with people who shared the vision that Moorlands had to equip men and women passionate about Jesus to impact the church and the world, then we should join hands with them. And SWIM was established. It had been going for a couple of decades. It had a good reputation. And so they became the first centre, Moorlands Southwest, in partnership with SWIM. And when the centre in the Midlands began in Birmingham, we knew that we couldn't just simply transfer the SWIM model to the Midlands. It needed to be different. And I think that's been the hallmark of how centres have developed. We've looked at what's happening on the ground, and we've said, let's join hands. These are people who are doing the same thing that we're doing. We share a core belief in the gospel. We want to see people equipped and trained. We want them to have a good training, a thorough training, but let's work with them. And that's how the vision for centres really expanded.
As the college continues to expand, we now have students scattered throughout the UK and even beyond. Many of our undergraduate students will still choose to study in a residential capacity here at Christchurch, but for many of our students, the placement-based mode allows them to study through our regional centres and only attend through block weeks. So here at Christchurch, for example, postgraduate students will come and study in that mode. The days of being in one location with the Clifford family and the college cow, they're long gone, but we do still have a staff residential presence. Ian and Ruth Coffey, when they came to join the team, also came to live here at the Christchurch site and make Rowan House their home. We now hear from them about some of the experiences of living on site at Christchurch.
When we came, because we didn't own anywhere and we've been living in France, Steve said, oh, the Rowan House is going to be available, it's going to be free. Why don't you move in there and get a look at the area? To which you said...
Well, we didn't have anywhere to live, so that was just like a real answer to prayer. And I said, well, we'll have a few months there, maybe a year, because I didn't think Ian would cope with living on site, community and all that business. What are we, 13 years later? And we're still here. Yeah. So, it's been fantastic for us as a couple. It's been fantastic for us, for our family. We've ended up having our family get-together. It's the biggest place anybody could find to be able to do that. And sometimes when there hasn't been students, we've been able to rent out rooms and have a big family get-together. In actual fact, for both of us, it's become a very special place. I remember previous people who've lived in the house have said that there's been some amazing memories. Colin Bennett, Dave Edwins said exactly the same thing. And actually, we've discovered that. I've looked after the grandchildren actually almost as soon as we arrived here. I ended up looking after them for a couple of days a week. And one of them calls our garden the little garden and Grandma's big garden. So it's the little garden and the big garden that we've been able to enjoy. It's a lovely area to be.
Unlike many experiences of higher education, for many people joining Moorlands means joining a family. And as we've seen, that's largely due to this emphasis on relationship development. It's always been our priority to encourage students to grow in their relationship with Christ, but also with each other and with the sense of community that they have. We see that being worked out in tutor groups and other areas of college life. And we're now going to hear from two former students and friends, Caris and Scott, about their memorable experiences of tutor group life.
So while I was at Moorlands, my tutor was Andy Defer, who's the head of and director of youth work, part of the senior management team here. I've got great memories of Andy Defer teaching youth work, culture, engaging with culture lessons, where he came in bright yellow and purple tracksuit bottoms, flat cap to the side, and started breakdancing and spoke about how we can engage with young people in foreign cultures. That was a great memory for me at Moorlands.
That's cool. So I had Ian Kirby as my tutor, and I was also in his cross-cultural module as well. So they were just he's very good at coming up with lots of different games to help you think about culture and language and all these different things. And we also just had great fun as a tutor group as well. So one of my favourite memories is when we all dressed up as X-Men to play volleyball, and he was playing Professor X, and he had this bald cap on, and I was meant to be pushing him in this chair, and then the privilege was taken away from me because I think I just took him over too many rocks and he was bouncing around, so someone else had to do that. So we had so much fun. It was great. So I took the Christian spirituality module in my third year without really knowing what it would be at all, or what it was really about. But it turns out it just gave me the most incredible vision for the global church in all its different forms.
I think primarily my time at Moorlands has just encouraged me to grow in my love and knowledge of the Lord Jesus. I think my passion for God's word and hearing God speak in his word has grown. I think my passion for the local church has also grown. But I also think my passion for pursuing my friends and family has also grown too. Being at Moorlands taught me what church family was supposed to be like, to come all ages and all different experiences of backgrounds, and to get along with one another in peace, to share that banter, to have the pranks that we had on site. I've got great memories with friends and staff members of really funny stories from my time at Moorlands, and they're used in sermon outlines and anecdotes all the time now. I've received a lifelong mentor in Andy Defer, absolute quote to him. So it's just a brilliant time for me.
As we heard there, being part of the Moorlands family really helps inform us as to what it's like to be part of a church family. And I believe the interdenominational nature of Moorlands College really helps us to grow in our sense of understanding and empathy with those we may disagree with, those from very different church backgrounds. And part of the Moorlands experience as we share together is to learn how to disagree well and to learn how to understand why some people may think quite differently than we do. As a family, we love hearing stories from our graduates scattered across the globe. This is a huge encouragement to staff and students alike, and remains a regular focus for students as they pray for graduates. We hope to find even more opportunities to connect with former students through our Friends of Moorlands initiative. There are so many people to appreciate who've contributed to what it is to be part of a family here at Moorlands. And over the years, many deep friendships have formed, and even marriages have come about through those relationships, those friendships made here at college. We now hear from David and Hannah just before their wedding, as they share with us their experiences of meeting at Moorlands.
Well, being at Moorlands was an amazing experience. I have to say, being fed and studying 10 seconds away from your bedroom was an amazing thing. It was a great thing. But you know what? The best thing was the community. I absolutely loved being in the community, being part of, making really good friends, friends for life, friends I'm still chatting to, friends I still see, even though it's been 3 years since I left. It has been great to get to know the staff members, the tutors, everybody. Everybody's just so amazing, and I have some amazing memories from being part of this community. I think the biggest takeaway for me was actually getting closer to God, seeing the scriptures in a different way, and getting to know lots of amazing people.
I love the fact that the lecturers and any staff member at Moorlands are there invested in you holistically. It's not just about your academic achievements or whether you're gonna get a job afterwards. They're genuinely interested in making sure you continue pushing in your relationship with Jesus, which is amazing. And I mean, I went to a uni before and I never kind of got that kind of treatment. There was a genuine family feel here that I don't think you'll really get anywhere else. But what I love about this place is also the fact that you get so challenged about what you believe in. You're surrounded by different people from different Christian backgrounds. And at first it was a bit scary having people who have different beliefs as me, same Christianity, but just different kind of opinions and strands of Christianity. But actually at the end of it, it was such a blessing, and it made me stronger in my faith more than anything, and led me to have lifelong friends.
As well as individual relationships, we've entered into collaborative relationships with other partners to help us develop theological education. And in 2019, that included the start of a new MA in Language, Community and Development with the Wycliffe Bible Translators. And we now hear from Phil King about the development of this new MA programme.
Wycliffe Bible Translators are focused on some of the most marginalised people groups around the world and helping them get access to the Bible and to be involved in things like multilingual education programs and getting people to engage with the scriptures. And we were looking for a partner who had that same passion for the Bible and seeing people transformed by the Bible. So when we first heard about Moorlands and came in contact with Moorlands and discovered their passion to see people equipped to impact the church and the world, that tied very nicely with what Wycliffe was involved in.
The growth under Steve's leadership saw the college expand its reach, and his popularity on the road meant that we developed many new friendships and partnerships. But nonetheless, after 2 decades of serving as principal, Steve felt it was right to hand over the baton once again to a new leader. In January 2019, David Hilborn joined the team as the 5th principal in the college's history. And we now catch up with David to hear about how he is taking the college forward in the next stage on its journey as it remains true to that original vision from 1948.
Through my predecessor, Steve Brady, there had already been really good connections with Northern Ireland. Steve had been over there and preached quite a bit, and we had good relationships as a college with a number of churches and networks in Northern Ireland. But this was new, and we were approached by YouthLink with a view to working together with them. And then in September of 2020, that new centre at Moorlands, Northern Ireland in Belfast opened, running our BA degree in youth work, and really, really pleased that our applied theology ethos as a college and our vision and mission are now being embedded in another nation of the UK. In fact, that's all part of vision that we have to develop Moorlands as a UK-wide institution. And with digital technology and blended learning and all that goes with where we are, with better broadband speeds and use of the internet and a virtual learning environment, which is now absolutely fundamental to all we do, we can deliver that. We can be a UK-wide college, and our Northern Ireland Centre is a big part of that. Now, originally the SLS partnership, the School of Language and Scripture, was based in Gloucester, where Wycliffe Bible Translators had their base. But I'm really delighted to say that after an initial year with the centre being based there, the whole of the School of Language and Scripture came onto site here at our main campus in Christchurch, Dorset, in September of 2020. And we welcomed the staff and then the students in those postgraduate programmes, which are now being delivered alongside our BA and MA programmes here on this wonderful campus that we have. So it's a delight to have that addition to our staff team and our student community through SLS.
It won't surprise you to learn, as I have done, that there are many elements of college life that have really changed dramatically since those early days. But it's fascinating as we follow this story to see that there is a common thread running through the decades. There was an original vision to Moorlands, which has remained consistent over the years, and it's informed how we've sought to train men and women for ministry. We've really benefited from that rich inheritance of the years, and that continues to shape what we're doing as a college today.
So I've spoken a lot about change over the years, and changes that I've introduced as principal. And we are a college that charts change and wants to make sure that we are following the leading of the Spirit through history. But what has also to be stressed is that I believe that where we're at now is in continuity with where the college was at when it started in 1948. The vision of the college then was an applied theology vision. David Clifford, our founder, was very focused on equipping people for evangelism, for youth ministry, for pastoral work in practical ways. And we carry the tagline Christian Theology Applied, and it applies to all of our programs and all that we do here. We believe that we are here for the Church of Jesus Christ, and that we do actionable theological training in terms of it being applied on the ground at the coalface of pastoral work, of congregational life, of mission across the world. So that vision that inspired our founder in 1948 is still very much at the heart of all that we're doing as we seek to equip people who are passionate about Jesus Christ to impact the church and the world.
As we've explored this history of Moorlands College, it's been so exciting to hear from David Clifford's family about how God gave him that original vision all those years ago in America, and how as a follower of Christ he was willing to step out in faith and be obedient to what God had called him to do. He didn't have the resources for all of this, but as the years have gone by, God has shown himself to be faithful. And that's such an inspiration to us as we look back on this story and how we can see that we can trust God as we look to the future, as obediently we seek to remain true to that original vision, and as we fulfill what God has called us to do as Moorlands College. It has also been a delight to speak to the friends of Moorlands College and hear about the stories and testimonies that reveal what impact this 70 years of training has had on the church and on the wider world. Each time the baton has been passed on to a new principal, we've seen how that vision has been passed on to a new leadership too. And that incredible vision of applied theology has really remained at the heart of what we do. Moorlands College has always existed to equip people passionate about Jesus Christ, to impact the church and the world, and that is what we continue to do today. We've only touched upon some of the stories of those who've been connected to Moorlands throughout its rich history, but often these stories have carried a similar theme. Tales of friendship formed, of growth in knowledge that's impacted practice and helped strengthen relationships, and most significantly, a growth in love for the Lord Jesus amongst this belonging to a family. As we look to the future and the ever-changing challenges of the 21st century, we can be confident that these themes that we've heard come up time and again will live on. And how encouraging it is that that vision that God gave one man to train and equip men and women to serve now lives on in the vast Moorlands family.